Dzień dobry. My name is Botan Cagań. I am a visiting fellow of Warsaw Institute from my institution, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to our first event about the Hungarian elections. Our guest today, we have the head of Social Sciences School and History from MCC, Mr. Sándor Galai, today.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation.
Also, András Hajdú, a researcher at the School of Social Sciences and History at MCC as well. András, sorry, I think you're muted.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the possibility to be here.
Yes, and last but not least, Jan Hernig, editor-in-chief and expert at Warsaw Institute.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you very much for coming here. So, first of all, I would like to start with you, Sándor, please. The Polish viewers usually interested in the way how the Hungarian political system works, because it's a bit different compared to the Polish one. Can you please elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. Although we have learned the expression of the Warsaw Express, which was actually meant to be the Budapest Express in the way back after 2015. But there are some marked differences. One of the first most important differences, the crucial role of the Prime Minister. The actual system of government here in Hungary is built on the extreme role of the Prime Minister, who, if enjoys a stable parliamentary background, can practically decide on every important aspects which are not subject to a qualified majority in parliament. It's also a very important difference between the two systems, that in terms of the electoral system, the Hungarian mixed system tends to favor the winning party. So it has some majority components which actually facilitate the overrepresentation of the winning party, especially if the party is supported strongly in the single member districts. I think these are the two most important differences when we compare the two systems. And of course, based on the first one, the role of the President of the Republic is not as strong as in the Polish system.
Thank you very much. And why is this election so different from the others if we took a look on the opposition?
It is different if we compare to the previous couple of elections, but it's not that much different if we take into account that between 1998 and 2010, we had a party system in which there were two main political actors, one from the center-right, one from the center-left. The center-left represented by the successor party of the communists, the Hungarian Socialist Party, while the center-right was dominated by Fidesz. These two parties actually represented actually more than 85% of the electorate when they were on their peak in terms of electoral support. And after that, after the 2010 election, we had a completely different party structure, in which one party emerged as a dominant player, that was Fidesz, and all the other parties were either in the position of a small or a medium-sized party. Now the forthcoming election will be different because the majority of the opposition parties, altogether 6 parties, were able to join their forces. They were able to harmonize their candidates for the single-member districts and will come up with a joint party list. So practically there is a more or less united opposition facing the governing incumbent party Fidesz. Although we have 2, 3, or even more small parties which are not part of the united opposition, and they will run with their separate party lists. But the new phenomenon is that most of the parties were able to come up with one single list and jointly supported candidates. That is to say, formed a major rival, a major opponent of the governing party.
Thank you very much. Andras, what do the main pollsters say about these elections? We have seen various kinds of it, but who to believe and what is the most trustworthy?
Yes, it's a very complicated question because we saw during the last months that the polls are very different, and it depends on that the pollster, that who is the preferred political actor by the pollster many times. So we see very different results, but the main tendency that the opposition bloc had a quasi wave in October during the primary period, their primary period. But after that, this wave disappeared, and now they have a negative tendency. And smaller actors, for example, the so-called dog party with two tails, maybe we can translate them. It's a joke. It's a joke party which positioned itself against the government and against the opposition bloc. And another actor, our country or our home, which is a split party from the Jobbik, became a little bit stronger, and they are around 5% in the polls, which is the threshold for the party lists who run separately.
I understand. Thank you very much.
So it's a new tendency. So yeah, I think it's a new tendency that our home or our country, which split from the Jobbik, is the only actor who are against the jabs, who are against vaccination, and they could build political success from this position during the last 2 months. And another tendency is the problems around Péter Márki-Zay, who is the leader candidate or the prime minister candidate of the opposition bloc.
Yeah, and
before
question.
Jan, sorry, before Jan, we go into
Yes.
we go into this. It's very important to point out to the Polish viewers that Márki-Zay was selected by a pre-election campaign, which. What do you think, Andras? Do you consider this a successful pre-election of the opposition, or not?
The primary was, I think, a success for the opposition bloc at the first step, because the turnout was quite high in this political action. I think the voters were maybe above 800,000 or something like this, around 900,000 voters who appeared during this primary process. And I think this was a big political success, a very important political success for the opposition bloc. But after that, this wave disappeared, as I mentioned. And it was a surprise that Péter Márki-Zay could win this election. But after that, he wouldn't like to behave as a prime minister candidate of a wide electoral or a wide political coalition. He behaved as an independent character in the politics, and there are a lot of problems and debates because of this role inside the opposition bloc as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and another question will be from me to both of you, because of course we see the split on the Hungarian political scene, and the question is, what can we expect from the political parties, whether they win, lose, right? How the new government's policy, in your opinion, will influence or may influence relations within the region of Central Europe? And I will ask Mr. Shander first.
Thank you. I think that the defragmentation of Hungarian party politics will not disappear after the election, regardless of the winner. Whoever wins will fuel strong opposition from the other side. So what we can expect is that this very overheated, emotional political culture and party contest will prevail. Of course, the actual consequences can be different on the different sides. If the incumbent party Fidesz wins, that can lead to a realignment within the opposition. That can mean the career or the end of the career of some opposition politicians. If the opposition wins, I don't think that that would undermine the current leadership of the prime minister within the party. But that can also lead to certain changes within the party, of course. But no such major changes can be expected as in the other way around. As to policies, foreign policies, I can say that generally some of the cornerstones of foreign policy are the same over the past 3 decades. But when it comes to the strengths or the importance of regional cooperation, we can see some major differences. We can see that for the current governing party, the Visegrad platform is very important because that can actually elevate the influence of these parties at European level, at international level. So they are very eager to continue the V4 plus format when it comes to bilateral relations with non-EU countries, for example, or to have a united platform on certain issues within the European Union before the decision making would actually take place in the European Council, in the Council of the European Union, sorry. In that sense, a change of government would probably mean less impetus to the regional cooperation. It can actually lead to a government which would be much more loyal, much more accommodating to the European expectations. Of course, it would also mean a smoother relationship with anyone who is not pushing against suspected national interests. We know that some of the opposition parties actually challenge whether we have such concepts, such notions like national interests, why the current government can be portrayed as a nationalist government, investing a lot in the protection, in the representation of the suspected national interests. This would certainly mean a change to the regional cooperation. It would devalue the regional cooperation if there were a change in government.
All right, the same question I asked to Mr. Andres, but I also would like to emphasize the issue of European Union here. How, in your opinion, would it look after this or that party wins? Do you agree with Mr. Shandor?
Yes, I agree with Shandor, and I would like to say only that I would like to say only 2 things or 2 issues. One is the issue that Poland and Hungary outside of the Eurozone nowadays, and I think it will also the future in the next years. So that it's very important that Poland is the biggest country inside the EU, which is not the member of the Eurozone. So I think this issue will be important in the future, and it's independent of the Hungarian government parties, which parties contain the Hungarian coalition or the Hungarian government. And the other one is the very strong economic cooperation of the two countries and common economic interests. For example, the Hungarian petrol company, the MOL, became a very important actor in Poland during the last year. And I think this economic context, this economic cooperation will be very important, and it's not depend on which parties are in the government or in the opposition benches.
Yes, yes. And another question I have, since I'm a Polish, right? I would like to ask you, about your assessment on the future of the relations between Poland and Hungary. How do you see the future of those two countries cooperating together, Mr. Shandor?
I think that regardless of the color of the government, generally Polish-Hungarian relations tend to be very pragmatic, where the national interests, where the interests of the governments fall in the very same direction, where they are matching, then there is a close collaboration. When there are different opinions, different interests, then they may tend to diverge. We can already refer to examples like the attitude towards Russia, for example, is very different in the two countries. Of course, if there is a change in government, this may change. We know that some of the current policies of the government have been heavily criticized by the opposition parties. And if I may add one more point to András' comment on Eurozone, the current opposition pushes for the introduction of the euro in Hungary. And of course, the fewer EU members are outside of the Eurozone, the more pressure on the outsiders to join the platform, to join the ranks and to introduce the euro as soon as possible. So now we have a solid bloc with Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary outside of the Eurozone. And I can imagine that if any of these countries decide to introduce the euro, the other two countries would face a stronger pressure to follow the same pattern. When it comes to bilateral relations, we know that the two countries are, in some respects, rivals, competitors. When it comes, for example, to the competition for FDI, where a new investment would land, whether it's in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic. In that sense, these are competing countries. When it comes to, let's say, collaboration at regional level, when it comes to, for example, the transport and the development of the transport system, the high-speed railway, for example, regardless of the color of the government, it's a mutual interest because it can facilitate several things. And I wouldn't expect a disruption in such initiatives and in such projects, even if there was a changing government.
Mr. András?
Yes, I agree with Shandor, and only one thing is also important, that if the Fidesz could win the election and form again the government after the election, I think the cooperation in cultural issues would be also important and relevant in the next years between the two countries. But this economic aspect is independent from the color of the government.
Yeah, so in your opinion, those cultural similarities would be actually, or could be actually, the factor which make those relationships between Poland and Hungary stronger, better.
Yes, and it's another question of the future, that how could these parties create a new group in the European Parliament or a new Euro party. So there are a lot of open questions in this story, but yes. I think these are the question of the future, and all of them depend on the result of the parliamentary election in Hungary.
And another question concerning results of the elections in Hungary I have. is already mentioned in our discussion, topic of relations between the Russian Federation and Hungary. Is it possible, in your opinion, that the outcome of those elections could influence this relation between Russia and Hungary, Mr. Sándor?
There is some probability, although I would be very careful, because the Hungarian party politics has the very same pattern, or has had the very same pattern for 3 decades now, that whoever is in opposition is usually very critical of any governmental attempts to be in a pragmatic relationship with Russia, not to be critical of the weaknesses of Russian political system, human rights, etc. issues. And when there is a changing government, we can see the changing roles. So the party which was in governing position and actually facing with some of the hurdles, some of the, I would say, practical constraints, be it energy dependence, be it the importance of Russian markets for certain Hungarian companies. What we can experience is that the governing party tends to be less critical, more pragmatic on Russian-Hungarian bilateral relations, with an opposition, regardless of the color, being very critical of this approach. And when there is the change of government, the parties change their place, change their platforms, and whoever gets to the governing position will soften the tone, will be more pragmatic, while the opposition party will strengthen the volume and be more critical. Now we have the same pattern. So the opposition is very critical of the relationships with Russia. It's too mild, not critical enough, not disciplined enough, not Western enough. That's the usual criticism. But I'm not so sure that facing the constraints, a new government would be completely different in its approach, in its attitude towards Russia.
Yes, indeed. Hungarian government is very practical. We need to admit that. And the same question to Mr. Andres, and another question concerning Russia from my side is how do the Hungarian government, current government still, or maybe we can elaborate on the future government, how the Hungarian government will or already reacted on what's happening on Ukrainian border, Russian-Ukrainian border, and of course it also touches the issue of relations with Russia.
Yes. The first question about the Russian, the cooperation between Hungary and Russia. Russia is a so strong geopolitical actor in this region that the Hungarian government should realize that situation. And that's the political life in this region. So I think the Hungarian government, both formed by left-wing or right-wing parties, try to manage this situation, and the economic cooperation, for example, by the energy prices, the gas prices are so important for the Hungarian economy that this situation could not rewrite by other ideological or other political aspects. And the other question about Ukraine, it's a very sensitive question in Hungarian politics because of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. And this Hungarian community had several conflicts with the contemporary Ukrainian regime and the contemporary Ukrainian government. It's a complex question. I think it could be another program to talk about this, but I think this topic is a central point in the contacts between Hungary and Ukraine. And therefore, the Hungarian government should behave always very, very sensitive in the question about Ukraine, and because of this geopolitical area, I think the the Ukrainian state could be an important partner and a quasi-bridge between Russia and other countries in the region. But we saw during the last years that nowadays that's not the situation. That's the political situation.
If I may come up with a few more comments on Hungarian, Russian, Hungarian, Ukrainian relations. The first issue is that the international coverage of the current Hungarian government's relationship with Russia is, I would say, not 100% correct. It always emphasizes that they do not want to have conflicts with the Russian government. They are afraid of any open confrontation. It's true, they are pragmatic. Nevertheless, when it comes to, for example, the ownership of the Hungarian oil company, they did confront Russian investors and their interests. They want to make strong efforts to have a stronger diversification of the supply of natural gas to Hungary, which is against the Russian interests. And this is something which is not really respected, not really accepted. On the other hand, when we had the previous 8 years of the socialist government, we can recall, for example, the strong support for the South Stream against Nabucco, which led to an international conflict within the European political scene. So in that sense, it's not so clear-cut who is more favorable to the Russian interests and who is not. That's one thing. The other thing is the very special situation in Ukraine, which is actually partly the situation of this the Polish minority too, that in the previous terms, what we could observe was that when there was a pro-Russian government in place in Ukraine, they tended to favor the interests of the Russian minority, and due to the national regulations, that of course increased the opportunities for the Polish and the Hungarian opportunities as well. Their rights were more respected. But then when there was a more Western-oriented yet nationalist government in place, which turned against the Russian minority, usually introduced legislation which went against the interests of the Polish and the Hungarian minority. Now there is a careful balancing. The Ukrainian governments try to have some exemptions for languages within the European Union as it's stipulated in the law. So they try to differentiate the Polish and the Hungarian minority from the Russian minority in their regulation. Nevertheless, we see that some of these exceptions are only for short term. And that, of course, creates a trap situation for not only the Hungarian, but also the Polish government. Because on the one hand, there is a mutual interest in the Western community to bring the Ukrainian country and the government closer to a Western integration, to have a close collaboration with NATO and the European Union. But on the other hand, if there is a government in place which turns against these minorities and their interests, that goes against the interest of the governments in the neighboring countries, in Poland and in Hungary. And this is the trap which cannot be resolved, which cannot be overcome without a changing attitude of the Western leaderships. We can see that if in NATO, which is not only a military organization, but also a political organization, they just sweep under the carpet the actual situation and the hardships of the minorities, minority rights should be respected for anyone who wants to seek membership and collaboration, close collaboration within NATO. And this is the situation where Hungary is in a way isolated. Even the Polish government is much more on the Western side for obvious interests. The Polish government is more Atlantic than the Hungarian in its attitude. It's more careful against Russia, etc. So we can understand this situation, but without finding a mutually agreeable solution, without finding something that can be accepted by all the concerned parties, I don't see a way out from the current trap, from the current situation.
Thank you. Andras, I'm very glad that you mentioned the Hungarian minority. in Ukraine, but also in general. Can you please elaborate on the stances of the opposition towards the minorities in general, in the Hungarian minorities in general in Slovakia, Romania, and Serbia?
It's it's the part of the mentioned emotional and overheated political culture and political context in Hungarian politics. It belonged to a referendum which was in 2004 about the dual citizenship of the Hungarian minorities outside the contemporary borders of Hungary. And in that campaign, the left-wing parties had the program or the opinion that this dual citizenship is not necessary or not allowed to the Hungarians outside of the borders. And many of the left-wing politicians, political parties, already in this point that they said that they should not have, for example, right to vote on Hungarian parliamentary election to the party lists and other questions we can mention, that they are not favor this situation which was formed after the parliamentary election in 2010 when the Fidesz won first time with two-third majority, but this legal act which guaranteed the citizenship and the right to vote to the Hungarians outside of the borders was voted by several other politicians who are nowadays the part of the opposition bloc, who try to create a common list and try to create a common campaign for the next parliamentary election. So there's a political conflict inside the opposition bloc also.
Excuse me if I interrupt you, Botond. Excuse me, we have a question from our viewer, so we can ask it right now to our guests. The viewer is named Miguel de Bosque, and he asked the question, what is Hungary doing with Visegrad to counter growing influence China in Central Europe? This is the question to our guests.
I think the guests also would like to...
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make it clear. I think the guests also would like to wanted to put in that also the opposition and the current government would look like in the future.
It's important to emphasize that for the future government, it's very difficult to envisage certain policies, especially on issues where they are divided. In the Western press, very often it is labeled as the Rainbow Coalition. One of the opposition politicians, actually called it a pigwash or a hogwash coalition. Very pejorative, but that came from within their own circles to emphasize that it's really a very strange fellowship. And therefore, it's very difficult to give proper forecast what to be expected from such a heterogeneous coalition in the event of a changing government. As to the Hungarian minorities, just one more point to finish on this line of thought. It's very important that the Hungarian minority is shrinking in numbers in the neighboring countries, and therefore the Hungarian government invests a lot in terms of both financial investments and financial assistance to facilitate, to improve their conditions and to facilitate their intention to stay in their homeland. And we have several projects and lots of money have been allocated for that designated purpose. As to China, actually there it's very tricky again, because the Hungarian government, similarly to the other governments actually, is very pragmatic on economic relations. And we can see that this Visegrad platform does not run a separate policy or a separate attitude to the Chinese leadership from the 16 or now 17 countries from the region, which actually encourage Chinese investments to the region, which would like to have closer collaboration, more intensive trade relations, etc. So I don't see actually major attempts to overcome the increasing Chinese influence in the region. On the contrary, there is a competition for Chinese capital. There is a competition for investing into China. And in that sense, there is no difference between the eastern and the western part of Europe. The difference maybe is the size of the economies and the size of the countries. Here in the region, we have much more smaller countries, and this is why we have a platform of the 17 countries negotiating with China in their economic relations. In political terms, the difference of the governments is the attitude of the governments is very different. What we can see is that the Polish government is 100% committed to the Euro-Atlantic collaboration. And if they are called on by the, let's say, American or the EU leadership to be more hostile on the Chinese expansion, they are immediately willing to take a similar stance, and to follow this advice. The Hungarian government is very different. Their attitude is very similar to that of the relationships with Russia, more pragmatic, I would say. And that's based on the assumption of the government that the actual weight, the center of the world economy is moving towards the Pacific oceans. What we can see is a rising Chinese giant. And you can see that in this competition, the US is still able to preserve its own positions, but the European Union is declining in its actual economic power, not to mention the political, which has never been really significant. And the Hungarian government actually wants to have bilateral relations which can overcome this lost sphere of influence on the one hand, while calling on the European leadership to change certain policies to increase the competitiveness of the European Union as such, because it's a kind of criticism of the European integration that, look, we are here with a giant market with lots of innovation, with very rich economies. We should not accept the decreasing power, the decreasing influence and role of the European markets. And this is what we can see, that the Hungarian government has this kind of divided attention, very pragmatic, very much in favor of closer collaboration with China on the one hand, when it comes to bilateral relations. But on the other hand, one of the strong critiques of the European Union and a strong promoter of increasing the competitiveness by joint efforts and by joint solutions.
Yes, I think also that the so-called new Cold War could be a danger for the region, and the governments in the V4 or at the Balkan countries try to build pragmatic economic cooperation both in the region and outside Europe.
Mhm.
Thank you. And coming back to the direct effects of the elections, the campaign is literally knocking on our doors, and some experts say that this will be the heatest one out of the last four campaigns. Shandor, what do you think about these kind of statements? Do you think that the campaigns will be heated, or it will be as
certainly, but we had the very same. Thank you. Certainly, we had the very same statements 4 years ago, then 8 years ago, 12 years ago. So always the next campaign will be the dirtiest, the most overheated. This has been a very clear trend, but based on actual experiences. Indeed, the previous campaign was dirtier than the one before, etc. So indeed, we can expect a very overheated campaign. I'm sure that the losing side, whichever will be very disappointed. I can imagine some immediate overheated responses, for example. This is something we already experienced after the previous elections, and since the actual fragmentation and since the emotional aspect of the party system did not change, it got even worse in a way. You are right to claim that this campaign will be again a very emotional, overheated, and a very challenging and dirty campaign. Yeah.
I see two new points, but I think maybe one of them is the real new point in Hungarian politics and Hungarian political campaigns. This is the central role of social media in political communication. It was important already in 2018 or in 2014. It was already important, but not dominant field of political campaign. And the other one is the collapse of the wall which separated private life of politicians from the real political questions and political conflicts. But it's not a real new element. It was the situation already in 2019 during the campaign before the local government elections. But I think the so-called wall between the private life of politicians and the political campaign disappeared at all for this campaign.
We
Yes,
have
thank you.
another comment on our chat, and I will just read it and ask if our guests agree with it or not. The comment comes from the same viewer who typed, Poland, Hungary should put Eurozone membership to a referendum vote. This was done in Denmark and resolved the issue once and for all. What do you think? Mr. Shander first.
It's not so easy legally because when these countries joined the European Union, it was part of the accession agreements, the accession treaties, that they are obliged to introduce the euro as soon as possible, which means that if they meet the actual criteria, the Maastricht criteria, they should introduce, they are in a way obliged to introduce. Of course, the pressure to introduce the Eurozone got much milder after the crisis of the Eurozone. So after 2008, the European leadership, the Commission accepted that these countries, these governments actually cancelled the official target dates. We used to have target dates. I remember for Hungary, they modified it 3 times, and then they just decided to release it. They decided to give it up. And the same stands for Poland. The same was in the Czech Republic. Now the new Czech government, we will see, but it was part of the campaign that they may come up with a target date. But I don't see anything like that in the Polish and the Hungarian governments. Of course, the opposition, if they come to power in Hungary, they would probably come up with a target date, a new target date. But the referendum cannot overcome legal obligations. It's a very special situation. Denmark had this opt-out. We do not have this opt-out.
I think the referendum about EU issues, it's not the interest of the EU leaders and the EU institutions. If we see the history of referendums about European issues, it's not favorable for the European integration. We could mention the Brexit at last, but in the past decades, we see referendums about Eurozone membership, for example, in Denmark, or the referendums about the EU constitution draft in France and the Netherlands. We saw that the voters who opposed the European integration or the new wider European cooperation was the majority. So I think new referendums about EU issues is not the interest of the leaders of the EU institutions.
Yes, thank you. I'm very glad that both of you have come up with legal obligations. In the Hungarian system, a two-third majority is needed to change the constitution. That's a legal obligation, even though during the pre-election of the opposition in the debates, some of the opposition candidates mentioned that they will change the constitution with a simple majority no matter what. Can this happen? What can we expect from these people if they get into power? Sándor, please.
In principle, it could happen, but I think it's much more of a political statement than a legal position. Of course, we see legal arguments which actually try to pave the way for such a modification. They even refer to a referendum which might actually approve these changes. But that would actually lead to a legally and politically messed up situation, so complicated situation, that the legitimacy of such changes would probably lead to political, I would say, chaos. So I don't think that the new leadership would dare to change the constitution with a simple majority. Even though in the campaign we see such promises, we know that some of the opposition parties are very determined to push towards that direction. But that would mean the end of all kind of legal stability in Hungary. And this is why I believe that there are very few reasonable political actors who would actually accept this view after the campaign period, after the campaign is over.
We mentioned that this opposition bloc is very complex, and this question depends also to this specialty of the opposition bloc. And if you ask them that how would they like to make a new constitution, and how would like they to manage this this process, you could hear several different answers. For example, Péter Márki-Zay said in an interview that he would like to organize a referendum about the constitution. So it's a complex question, and I think it's not their interest to make a debate about this question, because it's a debate of the political elite and the intellectuals, not the wider context of the voters.
And not to mention, it's very difficult to come up with something which is a coherent position. Because if you challenge the legitimacy of the current regulations, then who would accept your victory at the election? If you challenge the current constitution and say that you would need a referendum on the constitution, you may recall that even before the modification or the adoption of the new constitution, the previous constitution also banned a referendum on the subject of the modification on the constitution. So practically by referendum, it was also a constitutional court decision, a ruling. One cannot modify the standing constitution. So this is why I said that it could actually lead to a chaotic situation, because I understand the arguments of the opposition or some of the opposition parties who argue for the possibility of a simple majority, but it's very difficult to have a legally coherent position on such moves.
Yes, thank you. I'm also glad that you mentioned public votes, since a public vote will take place, or maybe another as well, on the day of the elections. Can you please, András, elaborate on that?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm very glad that both of you mentioned public votes, since public votes will take place on the day of the elections, or maybe another one, we will see.
Yeah.
Can you please elaborate on the public vote, which will take place on the 3rd of April?
Yes, it's a referendum about the education of young children in nursery schools, primary schools, grammar schools, and there are 5 questions which are based in this issue. And the position of the government is that the sexual education of the children should be the right of the parents at first. And the
Actually,
questions are related to this topic and this issue.
it's quite similar to the recent bill which was presented to the Polish Parliament, to Sejm, which would like to have a control over the associations, NGOs, whoever being admitted to such educational classes in the public school system. In the Hungarian regulations, we have a similar attempt by the government, but the difference is that this one has already come into effect. In the Polish case, you only have a bill, which is still to be voted on.
Yes, and during the last summer, there was a political debate between the EU Commission and the Hungarian government about this issue, and the political answer of the government was that they organize a referendum about these questions.
The gentleman speaking about this issue, we have another question from our viewers, and I will read it. What do the panelists think of the very negative portrayal of Hungary in the Western media? Many media outlets call Hungary or even Poland, quote, illiberal. Will the election change Hungary's image? Maybe I will ask Mr. Andres first right now.
I think this image or this portrait won't change after the election. It's a long history. Already the first right-wing government, which was incumbent between 1990 and 1994, had the same quasi problem in Western press or by foreign journalists. And the first Orbán government between 1998 and 2002 had the same political problems with the international media, especially liberal or left-wing media portfolio, because if we see, for example, other right-wing media platforms, for example, in the US, the picture is quite different. So I think this picture or these labels are strongly related to the political position of the media platforms. And I think this won't change after the election.
I only agree if the governing party. Yes, thank you. I would only agree if the governing party remains the same. So if Fidesz wins the government, obviously it won't change. But if there is a change in government, immediately from day next, it would be a completely different image of Hungary, as well as Poland in case of a change of government. We could already see this, for example, in Northern Macedonia. We could already see this in Slovakia. When there is a government which is more welcomed by the Western media platforms, the dominant platforms, I would say, immediately it will smoothen out everything. Everything will be all right. It will actually change the image of the country. One thing is sure that the current image of Hungary is very harmful to the government, to the country in general. It's also true that in many respects, it's I would say, not really correct analysis of the situation. So we can see several portraits, several articles, which are not based on facts, which are not correct, which are politically biased. This will not necessarily change. If there is a change in government, the bias will be from the negative to the positive side.
Thank you very much. Indeed, unfortunately, I think our time is up, but thank you very much for joining us today for our viewers, as also from our guests as well. Mr. Sándor Gallai, head of School of Social Sciences and History at Matthias Corvinus Collegium, also Mr. András Hajdú, researcher at the School of Social Sciences and History at Matthias Corvinus Dormitory as well, and Jan Hernik, researcher and directorate of Warsaw Institute. And thank you very much for joining us today. Please like our Facebook page and follow our further events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Good.